Democide is the murder of any unarmed or disarmed person or people by a government, including genocide, politicide, and mass murder. Democide covers non-combatants, deaths caused by governments directly due to targeting, torture, imprisonment conditions, labor camps, famine, etc. Most democide deaths have been by governments to its own people. It is impossible to truly get accurate historical numbers for the death tolls, but one of the most studied experts on the subject, Rudolph Joseph Rummell, who was a political scientist, taught at Yale, Indiana University, and the University of Hawaii, estimates that in the 20th century alone, there have been 262 million victims of democide. He concluded this after years of research and compiling data from over 8,000 reports and records. He showed that there is a clear relation between political power and democide. Political mass murder grows increasingly common as political power becomes unconstrained. At the other end of the scale, where power is checked and balanced, political violence is a rarity. The most absolute powers, namely Communist USSR, China, and preceding Maoist guerrillas, Khmer Rouge Cambodia, Vietnam, and Yugoslavia, and fascist Nazi Germany account for nearly 128 million, or 84%, of the deaths by democide in the 20th century. Here are the top three. Number 1. The Soviet Gulag State. 61,911,000 murdered between 1917 and 1953 in the name of creating a communist society begun by Vladimir Lenin and then taken over by Joseph Stalin. In order to create a new society, you have to destroy the current one, especially when private citizens own substantial amounts of farmland and properties. Local officials on behalf of the state were charged with quotas for arrest and executions of tens of thousands of people without cause. To fulfill the quotas, they often picked random citizens and charged and executed them for false crimes against the state. Millions died in forced labor camps where men, women, children lived together, where rape, disease, starvation, savage beatings, and gang rule were rampant. Others were purposely starved or deported to desolate wastelands to die of freezing and starvation. Probably almost 62 million people have been murdered by the Communist Party, the government of the Soviet Union. Old and young, healthy and sick, men and women, even infants and the infirm were killed in cold blood. They were not combatants in civil war or rebellions. They were not criminals. Indeed, nearly all were guilty of nothing. Some were from the wrong class, middle class, landowners, aristocrats, kulaks. Some were from the wrong nation or race. Some were from the wrong political faction. Some were just their sons and daughters, wives and husbands, or mothers and fathers. And some were in lands occupied by the Red Army, Germans, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians. Then some were simply in the way of social progress, like the mass of peasants or religious believers, and some were eliminated because of their potential opposition, such as writers, teachers, churchmen, or the military high command, or even high and low Communist Party members themselves. In fact, we have witnessed in the Soviet Union a true egalitarian social cleansing and flushing. No group or class escaped, for everyone and anyone could have had counter-revolutionary ancestors, class lineage, or counter-revolutionary ideas or thoughts, or be susceptible to them. And thus, almost anyone was arrested, interrogated, tortured, and after a forced confession of a plot to blow up the Kremlin or some such, shot or sentenced to the dry guillotine. Slow death by exposure, malnutrition, and overwork in a forced labor camp. Some examples of interrogation by torture as described by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Interrogation by torture would be routinely practiced. Prisoners would have their skulls squeezed with iron rings, a human being would be lowered into an acid bath, or they would be trussed up naked to be bitten by ants and bedbugs. A ramrod heated over a Primus stove would be thrust up their anal canal. A man's genitals would be slowly crushed beneath the toe of a jackboot, and in the luckiest possible of circumstances, prisoners would be tortured by being kept from sleeping for a week, by thirst, and by being beaten to a bloody pulp. The state would employ such devious tactics as using scholars and intellectuals to consort amidst the lower classes and prey on the sense of jealousy and resentment they already had for those who owned land and were doing better economically by convincing them that they were being oppressed. And all those who were doing better were their oppressors, creating division among the commoners so that the lower class was helping round up and police the middle class and upper class. Of course, in the end, the lower class were also imprisoned and killed along with all they had helped to imprison. Pawns in a game for the few in the Communist Party who truly held the power. In the words of Rudolf Rummell, the more power a regime has, the more likely people will be killed. Concentrated political power is the most dangerous thing on earth. Number 2. Maoist China. 1949 to 1987, 35,236,000 murdered. In the first half of the 20th century alone, China was plagued with infighting of nationalists versus communists and Japanese occupation. These alone accounted for well over 10 million massacred, but are of separate nature and are not counted in this 35 million toll. 1 October 1949, Mao Zedong officially proclaimed the People's Republic of China. Their principles derived from Marxist-Leninism as interpreted by Mao Zedong. Beginning in 1950, carefully and nationally organized movements were spawned in rapid succession. Land reform, suppressing anti-communist guerrillas, new marriage system, religious reform, democratic reform, suppressing counter-revolutionaries, anti-rightist struggle, suppressing the 5 black categories, etc. Only when these movements, and especially the total collectivization of the peasants and Great Leap Forward, destroyed the agricultural system, causing the world's greatest recorded famine, 27 million starved to death, did the communists begin to draw back from or slacken their drive. Shortly after this famine, in the mid-1960s, an intra-party civil war erupted between Mao Zedong and his followers, who wanted to continue the mass-based revolution in a more moderate, pragmatically oriented faction. The resulting cultural revolution probably cost over 1.6 million lives. Mao won, but only temporarily. With his death soon after, the pragmatist and capitalist roaders regained power and launched China into a more open, economically experimental direction, even a more liberal path until the Tiananmen Square demonstrations and subsequent massacres of 1989. Indeed, from October 1949 to 1987, the Chinese Communist Party probably killed more than 35,200,000 of its own subjects. These were landlords and rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries and bandits, leftists, rightists, capitalists, roaders, scientists, intellectuals, scholars, Kuomintang agents and Western spies, wrong and bad elements, and often their loved ones, relatives, and friends, even babies. All such human beings were sacrificed for the most massive, total social engineering projects ever forced on any society in modern history. For total communist power, over 500 million peasants were sacrificed, and the independent landlord, rich, peasant, and gentry were destroyed. It was for the forced, temporary redistribution of land to the peasants to buy their way into the party. It was for the subsequent nationalization and seizure of this land for communes, a military-like factorization of the peasants and farming. It was for the achievement of total power, the communist Chinese anthill 99 over the family, even its mating and sexual practices. It was for the full control and naturalization of all private contracts and businesses. It was for the eradication of any possible opposition to party doctrine and policies by intellectuals and scholars. It was for the proletarianization of scholarship and science and all highly skilled occupants. It was for the elimination of any wrong thoughts through regular struggle, aka brainwashing sessions in every neighborhood, group, and organization. And it was for the purging of any dissidents or opponents of the current party line, whatever the top party members at the time should pronounce it to be. In short, just as the Soviet Union, the sacrifice was for total control over all behavior and thought in the achievement of Marxist utopia. The way to virtually eliminate genocide and mass murder appears to be through restricting and checking power. This means to foster democratic freedom. Rudolf Rummell. All political power comes from the barrel of a gun. The Communist Party must command all the guns, that way no guns can ever be used to command the party. Mao Zedong. Number 3. The Nazi genocide state. 20,946,000 killed. As Rudolf Rummell put it, regardless of the massive democide by the Soviets or Communist Chinese, the only government mass murder that the world remembers and our school books describe is the Nazi genocide of the Jews, in which 6 million were slaughtered. But even this count ignores the vast number of people the Nazis exterminated. Overall, by genocide, the killing of hostages, reprisal raids, forced labor, euthanasia, starvation, exposure, medical experiments, terror bombing, and then the concentration and death camps, the Nazis murdered from about 15 million to over 31,600,000 people, most likely closer to 21 million men, women, handicapped, aged, sick, prisoners of war, forced laborers, camp inmates, critics, homosexuals, Jews, Slavs, Serbs, Czechs, Italians, Poles, Frenchmen, Ukrainians, and so on. Under Adolf Hitler, a madman at the helm of a radical party, mass democide was carried out. As all this makes clear, the Nazi leaders were absolute racists. They believed utterly in the superiority of their Aryan race. They had no doubt that they were the pinnacle of racial evolution, that eugenically they were the best, and therefore no inferior group could be allowed to pollute their racial strain. Inferior races were like diseased organs that had to be surgically removed for the health of the body. One Nazi doctor, looking at a smoking crematoria in Auschwitz, was asked how he could reconcile the slaughter with his Hippocratic oath. In the Nazi world, his answer was justification enough for the pain and death inflicted on millions. When you find a diseased appendix, you must remove it.